Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 701. I'm Tom Cagley, your host. With SPaMCAST 701, we go back to basics. Whether you call that quick meeting to coordinate the day, the Daily Scrum, stand-up, or a huddle is not material. Daily coordination is phenomenally powerful and useful, unless it isn't. Just making teams meet without benefit really is a bad idea. What else can be done? We also have a visit from Tony Timbol with another installment from his To Tell a Story column. In this installment, Tony discusses Agile requirements. Getting work done in Agile is not just user stories and a cloud of dust. Agile techniques when daily scrums don't work. The Scrum Guide states that the Daily Scrum, daily stand-up in Kanban, is an event in which teams plan work for the next 24 hours. The term team is critical to whether or not a daily planning session will yield significant value or not. The MIT Human Resources blog points out, although many groups are called teams, not every work group is a team. Teams are cool. So every group is called a team. The performance of a team requires everyone to interact and play a role together. Groups are collections of individuals whose performance is a reflection of their specific actions. Groups are often a reflection of gathering people with like skills together so they can be managed. Teams need to coordinate, groups less, but not entirely so. As a coach, one indication that I'm working with a work group is the recognition that people are working on a mixture of items that are not closely related, have no sprint or release goal, or when work is assigned to team members. Assignment of work is a special case because it locks in boundaries between people. The day-to-day microplanning envisioned by the authors of the Scrum Guide will either slip through the team's fingers and land directly on sharing status or become overhead in work groups unless they fulfill some other role. Let's focus on what the happy path scenario is for a daily meeting. The team coordinates activities and plans the day. The team gathers in person, virtual, hybrid, it really doesn't matter. Remember to be as intimate as possible, to briefly coordinate activities for the next 24 hours. The goal is to ensure the team meets the iteration or release goal. In more operational teams that do not have an iteration or sprint goal, the focus is more on asking for and providing help and replenishing the board. Cross-training is a post-daily Scrum daily stand-up activity. When microplanning does not occur, the first responsibility of the coach, that includes Scrum Masters, is to try to help the group become a team. Fix the problem. Team design, by the way, is a different article. If you are involved in coaching or transformation, that's the way it is an unacceptable answer. Failing to fix the structure of the team when a daily Scrum or daily stand-up are not used for microplanning and collaboration to achieve the team's goal, they are occurring for a reason. Assuming they are not just happening because someone said they had to do them, those meetings are scratching some other itch than planning, an itch that, however unagile, is often defended. When the goal of the daily meeting is something other than group planning, there are more efficient and less expensive ways for even highly agile teams to address disseminating status and have a social event. Some potential alternatives. Scenario 1. When stand-ups have become code for daily status reports. Use Teams, Slack, or other collaboration tools as a substitute for some meetings. Collaboration tools are excellent for capturing, documenting, and distributing status asynchronously. Tools allow team members to add status in a specific channel, which they can then be consumed as needed without having to gather people together. This approach works well for distributed teams or teams that are working on unrelated pieces of work where staying informed is useful but not critical for planning. For example, several years ago I worked with a small boutique consulting firm. The team, much more of a practice group than a team, delivered coaching and process improvement services. Daily, each person provided a status on where they were and what they were doing. A true daily stand-up wasn't needed, even though we used other techniques from Scrum. Scenario 2, when stand-ups are used for social engagement. Separate social and status components of the daily meetings. Push statuses to a more asynchronous push method such as collaboration tools, above, or videos or podcasts. Let people who need to consume status information do so on their own schedules. Hold a separate team meeting periodically to allow for social interaction. Stand-ups are not social events, at least not directly. However, when asked, a substantial number of people will say that the social aspect of the meeting is important. Embrace the need for social interaction, just don't confuse that with a stand-up meeting. Scenario 3. When daily scrums have become overhead due to extremely close collaboration. Change the cadence of your daily scrum. Cadence changes are useful where teams have rich internal communications. Mobbing is a scenario where the approach to work, the whole team working on the same problem together at the same time, often negates the need for daily fixed replanning meeting. Replanning occurs when it makes sense. For example, a team I was coaching was mobbing for an entire iteration, held a stand-up meeting after they completed each problem they were tracking. Some days they completed several small stories and therefore held multiple stand-up type meetings to replan. In other cases, when tackling larger stories, they held formal stand-ups every other day. After the experiment, the whole team decided to work on breaking larger stories down before working on them. A learning experience. Holding a stand-up when needed worked very well for that team. Scenario 4. When the risk of missing a date or not delivering a specific piece of functionality is high. Use risk to establish a stand-up cadence. A slightly different approach to changing the cadence of the daily scrum uses risk to accelerate or decelerate the number of micro-planning meetings that are held. Leveraging risk is a useful governor for scenarios where stories are tightly coupled and planning adjustments are needed more often than once a day due to the complexity of non-independent stories. In high-risk scenarios, consider shorter stand-up meetings multiple times a day. This approach can be used with teams that are distributed across the globe, with a stand-up daily scrum at the beginning and end of each day. Scenario 5. When the group is an accumulation of unrelated or very loosely related subteams that have no common sprint goal. Treat the subteam as separate teams. Each subteam will adopt daily micro-planning collaboration sessions with an additional weekly group stand-up to reinforce the social network of the broader group. Other Agile events may need to follow the same model depending on how unrelated the work of the sub-teams are. Scenario 6. When everyone does their own thing. Eek. Have everyone do personal Kanban. A group of people doing their own thing is by definition not a team in any Agile framework. Determine whether a common deliverable, release, sprint goal can be established, or just adopt personal Kanban and give up on stand-ups. Daily scrums, stand-ups are a great tool for micro-planning and collaboration when used appropriately. As a coach, I try to help teams find a way to use the event for the purpose it was intended. When, for whatever reason, that can't happen, there are other options than to pretend a daily scrum at a fixed time and cadence is the only available answer. Thoughts, comments, all welcome. Please feel free to reach out to us at spamcastinfo@gmail.com. We look forward to the conversation. Tony Timbol, welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Hey, Tom, great to be back again.
Hey, Tony, I'm sure that wherever you are, since this is the middle of the winter, it's snowing like crazy.
Not in Florida, but it's cold.
Okay, well, I guess we'll send some of the snow to you. just because we're having a weird winter. Rain one day, snow the next. Just go figure. Which is never, by the way, a really good thing when there's cold in between. So, nevertheless, your To Tell a Story column, and that was a story in its own right, right? That was a story. Your To Tell a Story column is a wonderful fan favorite. I think I'd like to continue down the path of hearing about the topics in your wonderful new ebook, which can be found at tonytimbol.com. Trade your email address, and that what people don't see is me rubbing my hands together for you because, no, I'm kidding. Trade for their email address, build your email list, and get this wonderful 55-page ebook on Agile requirements.
Yep, Agile requirements readiness.
Excellent.
Faster software delivery.
Requirements are one of those things that people get passionate about. Either they say, "Oh, we don't need any requirements. We'll just get user stories or something else." And I think they sort of miss the point that I think it's probably important to know what somebody wants and how they want it, sort of thing. Maybe we don't really need them to tell us how to do it. Yeah, we need something.
Absolutely.
What's the context when you're talking about Agile requirements and the whole idea of the artifacts of Agile requirements? What do you mean by context required?
So the user story form was a brilliant adaptation of getting the incremental development principle into the idea of shaping scope into small enough bites that you can get something done and show value, get fast feedback, right? So we all buy into that idea that the user story is a great element, and there are different forms of the user story that can work for folks, the job story, the ability behavior-driven development story, and so forth. So, but in the user story, the card conversation elements, right, confirmation, they provide context. So more than just a statement of, as a role, I want a goal so that I have a benefit. That's a great statement, but you also need that other stuff to provide what we call user story level context, right? But the user story itself and those other elements of what I would call line item context need a broader context above and beyond that. So the analogy would be that if a user story is a single brushstroke of paint in a masterpiece, you need to see the picture. You need to step back and you need to see the overall picture to see how it all fits together. So you have context about what type of painting you're actually painting. You know, how big is it? What is it? A landscape? Is it a portrait? What is it? And so that context is what requirements are needed for, in addition to the user story. And typically, those requirements are present in forms such as requirements documents, PowerPoints, maybe vision and goal documents. There are many different types of requirement artifacts that organizations try to provide so that there's a context for features and user stories to be written so that there's a complete, what I call meta story, because humans need a meta story in order to fit in their own story. Just like we, from a religious or philosophical point of view, would want to know how our little story of our lives fit into the broader story, and however you reach that, blessings to you. But organizations, when it comes to software, need a meta story of how this thing is going to work together. And so requirements artifacts and the many different types are needed to support the eventual development of features and user stories so that development teams have a complete context to build better.
Before we dive into what you might construe to be all of the artifacts, what do you mean by meta stories? Say more about that, Tony.
So the meta story is, so you've got a user story that says, as a claims adjuster, I want to process adjusted claims so that I can reduce costs. So you've got a user story that has some intent by, let's say, the product owner to provide that. Well, where does that fit? Is that claims fit within the insurance industry? Does it fit within the healthcare industry? Where does it fit? And where does it fit from a calendar and time perspective? Is this story important first part of the year, second part of the year? So there's elements of time, and there's elements of context that are needed that paint a larger story that the user story lives within. So just like an epic, right, is a large story that gives boundaries and guardrails for the subsequent derived children user stories, you need that. You need more than just the epics. You need the what's behind the epic, the larger scope. And so in the Agile Requirements Readiness book, we talk about how those things fit together. The meta story as the reason why you need more than just a user story to give developers a broader context for them to develop.
So, Tony, does this work like sort of a Russian stacking doll where there's something something behind this, something behind this, something behind this?
Well, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good, yeah, it is. I never thought of that analogy or the metaphor, but that's pretty much, that's pretty much a very good interpretation, yes. There's a story within a story.
But where does that layering stop? Where does it make sense to stop the overall meta or universal or the bigger story within the bigger story? Does it go on forever?
That's a great question. And so the way to solve that, because you can't have a problem with forever analysis or the never-ending story, which you don't.
That's one of my favorite movies of all time.
I know it is, but in development, you never want that. So one of the concepts or constructs we've built in this view is called the requirements pipeline. And businesses have a requirements pipeline whether we recognize it or not. The requirements have a beginning, they have an end, and they have a time frame. And so you have a requirements pipeline. The question is, how efficient is that requirements pipeline, and how is it synchronized with a development pipeline that also exists within the organization? And so in order to make sure that your requirements don't move into an endless loop cycle, we've defined a life cycle for requirements that basically says, look, no matter how you use or package your requirements, and there are many different requirement artifact types that you can use: vision and goals, business requirements documents, data models, ERDs, whatever it is that you're using, whether it's aspirational scope that supports planning or whether it's executable scope that supports development, those things have to be managed, and they have a life cycle from expression to consensus. And so the pipeline gives people a way in which to manage that flow so that it produces and is sensitive to the time constraints that we all live under. In other words, you've got the time box requirements development just like you time box software development. And so that's part of the Agile requirements readiness approach, is that introducing a time boxing concept for requirements development.
So this idea of the requirements pipeline, who owns that? Or is that another one of these mythical consensus-driven decision processes?
The requirements pipeline is owned by everybody. That's a thing. It's got to be a shared construct or an idea that everybody buys into, the fact that, hey, requirements artifacts enter into the pipeline and they have a life cycle and then they exit. Now, the key is, what do they exit for? Or how do they exit? And so what we've constructed, or our value proposition for what we call the Agile Lean Requirements Pipeline Framework, is that artifacts, they go into the pipeline, they go through their normal growth, their normal life cycle, but when they're done, they produce epics. Those epics become the work product, the distillation of the intent of the requirements artifacts. So if you have a functional roadmap, and by the end of that functional roadmap, everybody agrees, yeah, we want these big pieces of capability delivered in these particular quarters, that's great. Now, those authorities, they have to create epics out of those, so those epics can be handed over to the teams to begin immediate decomposition and mapping into features and user stories. So, and we have a particular epic description format and templates that people can use to say, look, regardless of what the artifact is, it could be a vision and goals document. Perfectly fine. Out of that, you got to come up with epics. Those epics give the development teams starting point material for backlog refinement. And so who's going to write the epics? The people who've been writing the artifacts. They have to make that transition, and we have different epic description formats that you can use to say, now we've got to distill the context into consumable scope so that the teams can begin to turn aspirational scope into executable scope.
Tony Timbol, thank you for bringing your wonderful To Tell a Story column to the Software Process and Measurement Cast. Tony, where would people find out more about things like the Agile readiness or the Agile requirements pipeline? Where would they find out more about your ebook? Where would they find out and continue the conversation with you?
TonyTimbol.com. I'll be posting a lot of these concepts and blog posts from my book. In addition, you can get the entire book in exchange for your email as I'm building my email list. And I love to have a continuous conversation with folks out there from all different parts of the Agile community. And so the ebook's free, and you can have it just for an exchange of your email.
Super. Tony, thanks again for bringing your To Tell a Story column to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it.
In Reread Saturday News, the chapter this week of Why Limit WIP We Are Drowning in Work is titled Creating an Economy. In the past decade, certain words have become toxic. Words like process, waterfall, and output have become taboo in certain corners of software-related industries. Add the word productivity to the mix, and many people would grab torches and pitchforks. The vilification of these words, or any words, is sort of like burning books in my mind, makes it difficult to talk about systemic improvement. As a Kanban practitioner, I focus on flow, but not just flow. I advise my clients that they should keep their eye on continuously improving the flow. Continuous improvement yields better outcomes. Organizations, teams, and individuals that overextend and exceed their WIP limit are not improving their delivery of outcomes, but rather, in Jim Benson's words, disrespecting your ability to create amazing things. More bluntly, they are neither effective nor efficient. Link in the show notes to this week's installment. Link in the show notes to buy a copy of the book and read along, and all previous installments. In the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 702, finally, Matthew Steeb and I talk about the impact of leadership when building a technology-driven business. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?